Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to the seminar organized by the Iran Heritage Foundation. My name's John Curtis, and I'm the Academic Director of IHF. It's glorious weather here in London, and I hope it is wherever you might be joining from. Although, of course, in Mumbai, it's already late evening, and I've just been told that the monsoon has broken this morning. However, a particularly warm welcome today for those of you joining us from India. This is the 9th webinar that Iran Heritage Foundation has organized since the beginning of the lockdown, and 3 of them have been connected in one way or another with the Epic Iran exhibition. As you'll know, the exhibition has been organized, co-organized by Iran Heritage Foundation with the Victoria Endowment Museum in association with the Sarikani Foundation. The exhibition opened on the 29th May and will run until the 12th of September. Some of you will already have seen the exhibition, but for the benefit of those who haven't, I'll very, very briefly describe a few objects of Zoroastrian interest that are in the exhibition. Of course, these objects mainly date from the Sassanian period. That's about sort of the 3rd to the 7th century AD, perhaps a little bit later, when Zoroastrianism became the state religion in Iran. What you can see on the screen now is a silver dish in the Wyvern collection, showing a bird with a halo and wearing a diadem with the distinctive tasseled ends, a sacred emblem of kingship. And also on the screen is a silver dish in the Sarikani collection, showing a dancing woman who is sometimes identified as Anahita. The next one. Then we have a selection of Sassanian coins in the exhibition. These generally have fire altars on the reverse, and the coins of Ardashir and Shahpur have inscriptions in Pahlavi, referring to them as being worshippers of Mazda. The next one. The textile on the right, I think, is probably my favorite object in the exhibition. It's a silk textile from a Benedictine monastery on the outskirts of Paris. It's late Sassanian period, but it's been in the collections of the monastery since at least 1000 AD. So one of the earliest pieces to have arrived in Europe. And again, it shows the bird with a halo and wearing a diadem. The next one, please. There are 3 manuscripts of Zoroastrian interest in the exhibition. There's a manuscript of a Zoroastrian law book copied in Yazd, written in Avestan and dating from AD 1647. There's a copy of the Bunda Hashtan, which comes from India, and there's a manuscript from Dunhuan in China. The next one. There is, of course, a splendid catalogue accompanying the exhibition, which is available now to buy. And I'd just like to remind you that if anybody feels so minded, donations to IHF would be very welcome indeed. And you can make those donations, as you will see on the screen there. Before coming on to today's events, I'd just like to tell you about some forthcoming events. On 7th of July, we're going to have an evening about Persian poetry when Professor Karami Haqqaq will be in discussion with Narges Farzad. On 4th, there'll be an event on contemporary art, hosted, we hope, by Ina Sarikani. And then on 15th of September, that's just after the end of the exhibition, we're intending to have a retrospective about the exhibition. And what we're hoping to put together is a panel of experts who will consider questions and comments about the exhibition and indeed about the various webinars that we've organized. So if you do have questions and comments that you would like to be addressed at this webinar, please send them to the Iran Heritage Foundation information account, and you can find the address on our website. Well, today it's a great pleasure to be organizing this event dedicated to Zoroastrianism, and the very distinguished scholar Khojeste Mistree, whom incidentally I had the pleasure of meeting nearly 50 years ago now at a site in Iran. Khojeste is going to be in conversation with Dr. Sarah Stewart and Malcolm Deboo, the president of the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe. The event's going to be chaired by Sarah Stewart, who's senior lecturer in Zoroastrian Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and the co-chair of the Shapoorji Pallonji Institute of Zoroastrian Studies. Lastly, before we start, I'd just like to remind you that you can, of course, type in your questions as we proceed through the webinar, and you should put those in the Q&A box. There won't actually be any chat facility. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sarah. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for moderating this event.
Thank you, John. Am I visible?
Yes, you are, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thanks to IHF for organising this event, and a warm welcome to all of you who've joined our webinar today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Khojeste Mistree, who is our main speaker, and Malcolm Deboo, who will join me as a discussant. So for those of you who don't know Khojeste, he was educated in Pune in India, and then went on to finish his education and train as a chartered accountant in the UK, becoming a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in 1979. But during that time, he also studied at Oxford, Oriental Studies, under the guidance of, first of all, Professor R.C. Zainer, and then Professor Mary Boyce, so two leading experts and scholars in the field of Zoroastrian studies. And perhaps it was during that time in his life that he decided, as a result of this study, to give up chartered accountancy altogether, return to India, and devote the rest of his working life to Zoroastrianism. So he has given numerous lectures, seminars, workshops. He's published both in India and abroad. And he founded Zoroastrian Studies in Mumbai, and also the Arthavan Educational Trust, which is dedicated to the training of priests. And he's also was elected a trustee to the Bombay Parsi Panchayat, where he served from 2008 to 2015. Now, Khojeste is a frequent visitor to Iran and has taken tours there over many years, connecting, if you like, the Parsi community with their co-religionists in Iran, and visiting the Zoroastrian communities throughout the country. But I would like to finish my introduction to Khojeste on a personal note to say that there are few scholars of Zoroastrianism who have not been welcomed into the Mistree household on visits to Mumbai, made use of their extensive library, and been sent on their way armed with numerous contacts and all sorts of useful information. Malcolm Deboo is the 26th president of the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe, a London-based charity which was established 150 years ago. After leaving university, he worked in the ZTFE library and opened the doors, and has done ever since, to visiting students, scholars, civil servants, anyone interested in learning about the community and the culture and heritage of Zoroastrianism. Malcolm represents the interests of UK Zoroastrians with the government, religious and educational institutions, and he's also a trustee of the Interfaith Network and a moderator of its Faith Communities Forum. So welcome to both of you. And I'm going to start with my first question. Khojeste, for those who don't know, could you tell us something about Zoroastrianism and what Zoroastrians believe in, bearing in mind, of course, that Zoroastrians worldwide are not a homogeneous group when it comes to beliefs and practices?
Well, thank you very much for this invitation to give this presentation this evening. So thank you, John, and thank you, Sarah. To say a few words on Zoroastrianism, there's a lot to say, but I'll try and be as brief as I possibly can. The Zoroastrians are the followers of the Iranian prophet Spitaman Zarathustra, known to the Greeks as Zoroaster, recorded by Xanthos of Lydia in the 5th century BCE. Zarathustra, it is conjectured, lived and preached somewhere around the south of the Aral Sea, which you can see on your map, that little sort of point there above the green area. And he lived between 1500 and 1200 BCE, making his teachings the oldest revealed religion in the world. Next, please. Zarathustra's message was revealed in his poetic hymns, the Gathas, in the Avestan language, which is a sister language to Sanskrit. He revealed in his hymns that there was the one supreme, all-knowing, eternal God of the good creations, our Master, the Lord of wisdom, the wise one, who is wholly wise, benevolent, and just. Zarathustra taught that our Master is a friend to all, never to be feared by anyone. Zarathustra also postulated a cosmic and an ethical dualism in which he justified the concept of two spirits. He revealed Spenta to be the Holy Spirit of our Master, whose diabolical adversary was Angramenu, the evil or hostile spirit. In the later Middle Persian texts, our Master conjugates to Hormazd, and Ahriman becomes Ahriman, the evil spirit. Within this dualistic paradigm, Hormazd, it is said, fashioned the 6 other bounteous immortals, known later as the Ameshasvans, and likewise Ahriman miscreated his team of Devs. Importantly, there is a crucial difference between our Master, the Lord of Wisdom, and God in the other religions of the world. Our Master is omniscient, but not, it is deemed, to be omnipotent or almighty, as his power is limited, and therefore logically one can rationalize why bad things happen to good people. The Zoroastrian response is that if God was an almighty being, then God surely should be able to prevent all the evil happenings in the world. But this in reality does not happen. Zoroastrians recognize the force of evil as real, which one has to combat, if you like, with the forces of good. The Zoroastrian rationale being that our Master is not almighty, evil triumphs periodically, and so bad things do happen to good people from time to time. Surely an almighty being would have the power to prevent a 10-year-old girl dying from disease, but this does not happen as death strikes all the creations. Zoroastrianism does not support the concept of reincarnation or predestination, which some of the other religions fall back on to explain why pain, cruelty, imbalances, and the unfairness of life takes place. How then do we explain the existence of evil in Zoroastrianism? Light is seen as the abode of our master, or Hormas, and the absence of light results in darkness. Evil is the absence of good. Likewise, falsehood is the absence of truth, as indeed death is the absence of life brought about by Ahriman and his team of thieves. This brings me to another important difference, which is that in Zoroastrianism, there is a belief in a supreme Godhead, our master who is aided and supported by a team of divine beings, invoked and worshipped through prayers and rituals. In other words, Zoroastrianism does not promote a monotheistic Godhead, but a henotheistic one, which believes that our master is supreme and he has a task force of divinities forming a henotheistic paradigm. Who are the key divinities or bounteous immortals in Zarathustra's revelation? They are the good mind, the highest truth, sovereignty or power, piety or devotion, perfection or wholeness, and immortality or undyingness. These are key attributes intrinsic to the bounteous immortals, not only to help human beings, but to lead a righteous Zoroastrian life. But each of these bounteous immortals also has the task of looking after the 7 creations of Ahura Mazda. According to our creation story, which is quite long, but to summarize, the story is divided into 4 sections of 3,000 years each. First 3,000 years, the world was created in a spiritual state. The next 3,000 years, the world was in a physical state. The next 3,000 years, the world was in a state of conflict with the attack of Ahriman on Ahura Mazda's good creations. And the last 3,000 years is when Ahura Mazda sent Prophet Zarathustra with his revelation to basically bring about harmony and peace into the world. Now, at one level, you might say that this also applies metaphorically to man. Man is quarter spiritual, quarter physical, quarter in conflict, and quarter in resolution. So the promise given in the creation story is that there will be the resurrection of the physical bodies of human beings. There will be the last judgment for all souls from heaven and hell, and there will be the concept of life everlasting. It is important to note, therefore, that Zoroastrians as human beings have to try and generate good words and good deeds as often as possible as versus bad ones, because it is said that the soul is judged at the metaphorical bridge of the separator when it is judged by a divine team. It's also very important to note that the creation of wealth forms part of Zoroastrian spirituality, with a caveat that acts of charity must emerge from the wealth generated by human beings. Fasting, monasticism, celibacy, renunciation of the physical world, or flagellation of the body are not seen as meritorious acts in Zoroastrianism, leading to the highest spiritual existence. The soul, obviously, on the 4th morning after death is judged at the bridge of the separator and therefore goes to the house of song, which is heaven, or to the house of deceit, which is hell. Rituals play a very important part in Zoroastrian tradition because rituals basically helps one to, in a sense, emotionally experience the spiritual world. It helps one to gives one a spiritual understanding, if you like, as to what the spiritual world is all about. To conclude then, Zoroastrianism is a religion and not a mere philosophy, as one is expected to recognize both the physical and spiritual dimensions of reality within oneself by following the path of righteousness, happiness, and of good living. The state of being happy is harmony within oneself. And this is very important. By being in harmony with oneself, one tends to create an harmony in the environment, which, if you like, modern man calls ecology. So I'd like to end by saying to you that the Zoroastrians probably were the first practicing ecologists in the world. We celebrate the birthdays of all the 7 creations. And importantly, to conclude, this leads one to be righteous, happy, and caring for the creations. This, I would say to you, is the message of Spitaman Zarathustra. Thank you.
Thank you, Khojeste, for a very comprehensive overview of. Am I visible again? I can't see whether I am. Doesn't matter. But as long as you can hear me, thank you. And but I thought listeners might be interested. I want to open the discussion by going back to your own background and studies. I wondered to what extent, when you give these talks, you have your academic hat on, and to what extent you speak as a Parsi or as an insider, or are these two things, is there no distinction between the two? It's just a thought, and perhaps you could give a quick comment on that. And then Malcolm might like to come in as well.
Well, Sarah, obviously I have to be true to my academic background, and therefore the facts and figures and so forth that I come out with obviously resonates with academia. But I also recognize that Zoroastrianism is a living reality. And in that case, one has to experience the religion through the power of prayers and rituals and so forth. So if I'm speaking exclusively to a Parsi audience, then after having given, if you like, the theological background, one then begins to take on board aspects of rituals, aspects of the tradition, aspects of history to make it more relevant to modern times.
Good, well, thank you, thank you. I should just say to our audience that I am keeping an eye on questions that are coming in, and I'll do my best, but they will be at the end, that I'll invite Khojeste to answer some of them. Malcolm, is there anything you'd like to add to that? Again, as a Parsi, and you give talks and so on as well at ZTFE.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I ask Khojeste something, I'd just like to, first of all, on behalf of the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe and the Zoroastrian community in the UK, like to thank Dr. John Curtis and the Iran Heritage Foundation for organizing a session with Khojeste Mistree on Zoroastrianism to sort of coincide with the Epic Iran exhibition. Also, as for Khojeste, of course, thank you. I mean, besides not only studying in the United Kingdom for many years, Khojeste has always been welcome at the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe and is in fact our life member. So we are glad to have one of our members speaking, delivering a lecture on Zoroastrianism to the wider world. Now, as Khojeste, thank you very much for expounding the basic tenets of our faith. What I would like to touch is slightly on the historical aspects, is this, that, I mean, in the introduction, Dr. John Curtis mentioned about the Zoroastrianism and the state religion during the Sassanian Empire. But as my understanding of history, and I think many Zoroastrians will share this, that Zoroastrianism was practiced, we know, as you mentioned, much prior to the Sassanians, but was also practiced by during the Achaemenian times, during the Parthian dynasties as well. In fact, for well over 1,000 years, until the battles of Khojeste and Nehawand, the Zoroastrianism was an imperial religion of Iran and the neighboring sort of surrounding areas. Today, of course, we are quite marginalized, but my question is very specific for you to expound on the practice or the religion prior to the Sassanians. And also one thing I find is usually that when we look at sort of pre-Iran, prior to the Arab conquest, and post-Iran, after the Arab conquest, the post-Arab conquest is seen very much as Islamic Iran, or under everything under Islamic culture. But I'm slightly perplexed that prior to the Arab conquest of Iran, Iran is not seen as such, as Zoroastrian Iran, if you quote unquote, is very often seen as part of the Persian Empire, or the religion of, or not necessarily the religion of the Persians. Cyrus, for instance, the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty, was not quite Iranian. So if you can just slightly expound on that, very much appreciated.
Okay, that's a long question that you've asked, Malcolm. But let me say to you that from my studies and from my understanding and reading of history, I believe that the Zoroastrianism became the state religion of the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanian dynasties. I strongly believe, and I'll give you reasons why I believe this. I believe that Cyrus, who founded the Achaemenid dynasty in 550 BCE, he had all the qualities of being a righteous Zoroastrian, for he worshipped the concept of Asha, that is truth and order. He had a respect for the religious views of his subject people. He showed religious tolerance of a high order, always upholding Zoroastrianism, in my view, when he liberated the Jews and allowed them to return back from Babylonian captivity in 539 BCE. And not only that, monies were provided from the Persian treasuries by his successor kings to rebuild the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Cyrus also returned the gods of Sumer and Akkad, which were installed in their sanctuaries back from Babylon. So the degree of religious tolerance and respect can only come from someone who was linked to a non-proselytizing faith, which gives freedom of space to a plethora of religious beliefs and practices. According to Greek sources, Cyrus's daughter was named Atausa, which in its Avestan rendering is Hutausha, the wife of King Vishtaspa, who was Zarathustra's royal patron nearly 1,000 years earlier. I do not think this name can be written off as coincidence. According to Herodotus, Cyrus was married to Cansandene, the daughter of Pharnaspes, and Achaemenian. This is according to Herodotus, Book 2 and 3. Importantly, the reverence towards fire is central to Zoroastrian worship. Herodotus, who lived in Achaemenian times, confirms the practice of Zoroastrian showing a great reverence for fire and water. At Pasargadae, 2 stone-pillared altars have been found, similar in style to the stone altars found at Naxxurustam, next to Persepolis and close to Pasargadae. Clearly, it is during Achaemenian times that Iranian kings prayed before their own hearth fires, as found in the iconography of the hypogeums at Naxxurustam. Interestingly, archaeological evidence shows that fire was worshipped in the 8th century BCE at the Indian site of Tepe Nushajan, which Dr. John Curtis excavated near Hamadan. The fire altar excavated at Tepe Nushajan appears to be similar in style to the fire altars found at Pasargadae and Naxxurustam. I could go on giving you more reasons why I think Cyrus was a Zoroastrian. So, for example, his sarcophagus upholds all the laws of Zoroastrian purity. It has a double roof, a stone roof. It's off the ground, as you can see. It has a door. The body of Cyrus was laid to rest in it. Interestingly, there are flower designs around the sarcophagus. The flowers represent the world of immortality, immortality obviously for the soul. And then there were rays of the sun, which again indicates, if you like, Cyrus's Zoroastrian connection. There were huge waterways and gardens and so forth. Again, something that Zoroastrianism has always promoted. Why would King Darius, who literally came to rule 10 years after Cyrus, mention the name of Ahura Mazda 63 times in his old Persian inscriptions when he said, for example, a great God is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created yonder sky, who created man, who created happiness for man, and who made Darius king, one king in many. In other words, this entire inscription, in a sense, reflects Zoroastrian sentiments. Darius took his wife Hutausha as his queen, who was married earlier to his predecessor, the son of Cyrus, Cambyses, 530 to 522 BCE. During Darius also in another inscription declared that his father was Hishtaspi, an Achaemenian. In Old Persian, the word is Hakmanish, a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan of Aryan lineage. This to me establishes the Achaemenian lineage from which the nomenclature of the Achaemenian dynasty comes from. Now, another very important point that scholars have not really talked about is the revelation and teachings of Zarathustra were transmitted to his Iranian people in the Avestan language orally for over 2,000 years. There was no Avestan alphabet in Avestan or Parthian times until the Avestan alphabet was invented by an unknown genius in the 6th century CE. Therefore, the recording of Avestan prayers, etc., could not have taken place in the form of inscriptional Old Persian. Interestingly, again, in the proclamations of Darius and his subsequent son Xerxes and Artaxerxes, what do the proclamations declare? The proclamations once again declare a strong link to Zoroastrianism. King Darius declared, quote, by the will of our master, or Ahura Mazda bore me aid. The kings governed with a strong sense of innate Zoroastrian dualism when Darius said, I'm a friend to the right, I'm not a friend to the wrong. What is right is my desire. Let Ahura Mazda protect me from evil. Thus this I pray to Ahura Mazda, that I do not leave the true path. If this doesn't resonate Zoroastrian sentiments by Darius, who literally ruled 10 years after Cyrus did, I don't know how one can then say that he was not a Zoroastrian. Darius' son Xerxes declared, quote, then by the will of Ahura Mazda, I destroyed the Deybo sanctuary and made the proclamation that the Deybos shall not be worshipped. The man who has respect for the law which Ahura Mazda has established with due order and rights, he becomes happy while living and blessed Atravan when dead. There's a very important treasury tablet at Persepolis, which has been commented on by Pierre Briand in his book From Cyrus to Alexander. And I think this is a very important tablet that one should take account of. On one of these treasury tablets at Persepolis, there is a representation of a pillared fire altar with the Phraortes emblem on the top of the fire altar and two attendants standing on either side. One attendant is seen holding a bundle of barsum rods and the other attendant is tending the fire. Clearly, both these attendants are priests, suggesting that they must have been Zoroastrians, because what other religion exemplifies this particular image? This reference comes from Cyrus to Alexander by Pierre Briand, page 250. In the Oxus treasure, we have a gold plaque which shows a priest holding a bundle of barsum rods etched onto the plaque. Obviously, the priest comes from remote antiquity and in my view could only be a Zoroastrian. There are many additional references that I can give from Achaemenian times, but if I move to Parthian times, which was from 248 BC to 224 CE, The Parthians also believed in the worship of fire. The Parthians also believed in the worshipping of water. Strabo in the 1st century remarks that fire kindlers of the Persian gods. He also remarks about the Magi offering dry wood without any bark to the fire, as well as observing that the Magi do not blow onto the fire with their breath, a practice which we follow to this day. Charak, sometime in 70 CE, records an ever-burning fire in the town of Arsa, where Arsaces was proclaimed the king of the Parthians, who was the founder of the Parthian dynasty. It is in Parthian times that we have information about the 3 great ceremonial fires, Adur Bozenmer, Adur Fanbag, Adur Gushnas, having been established in Iran. It is also in Parthian times that the religion, in a sense, was decentralized and therefore continued. If we move now to Achaemenian times from 224 to 240 CE, it is important to note that Herbert Tansar, who was the high priest during the reign of Adishir I from 224 to 240 CE, Tansar was a powerful prelate and went on to establish a single canon of the Avestan literature. We have important reforms which took place during the early Sassanian period, a calendar reform where a 360-day Zoroastrian calendar was changed to a 365-day calendar. The slide that you see shows dome architecture first coming into existence from the drawing board of a Parthian architect. We also have many, if you like, references both in stone as well as in written form, in text form, because Avestan was invented by the end of the Sassanian dynasty. Adishir's son Shapur had a very powerful prelate by the name of Kirdir. His inscriptions were inscribed in stone in royal form. We again have a lot of information to suggest that all these inscriptions reflect a Zoroastrian point of view. Shapur II, who was from 309 to 379, he had the great prelate Adurbad Marispand. Adurbad Marispand underwent a fire ordeal, and we are told that he again was instrumental in a sense, promoting the religion, which to this day, literally 1600 years later, the Parsis follow. So in other words, what I'm saying to you, that we have enough evidence, not necessarily only in written form, to indicate that Cyrus couldn't have out of the blue been a non-Zoroastrian, and Darius couldn't out of the blue have promoted what I see to be mainstream Zoroastrianism. I'm sorry to have taken longer, but I thought it's important that I put before the participants a lot of facts and figures to show that the Achaemenians certainly were Zoroastrians.
Thank you. Thank you, Khojeste. Is there anything you want to add then to the question that really links to the exhibition, which is how old is the Zoroastrian religion and what evidence in the Achaemenid period? I think you've more than covered that, right? And
yes,
I would like to just ask you a quick question on that, because there is a debate about why there's no mention of Zarathustra in the Achaemenian period on the rock inscriptions, and people have varying views about that, and that's one of the key arguments to suggest that the early Achaemenids were not Zoroastrian. So perhaps you'd like to comment.
Yes, I would like to certainly comment on this. Yes, there is no mention of Zarathustra in any of the Achaemenian inscriptions, only references made to Ahura Mazda, to Mitra, to truth, Artha, and so forth, and to fire. But could anybody in their right mind say that neither did the Sassanians, neither did Kirdir, neither did Tansar, neither did Adurbad Marispand mention the name Zarathustra in their inscriptions. And nobody can turn around today and say that the Sassanians were not Zoroastrians. In short, what I'm saying is that the name Zarathustra or his position was not important. What was important was his message and his teachings. And that comes through loud and clear, both in Achaemenian times, in Parthian times, and in Sassanian times. And interestingly, the term Zarathustra is something that takes on greater relevance, if you like, after the Sassanian period. So what I would like to say to you is that in Achaemenian times, there is no word for Zarathustra, but that is common to the entire imperial dynastic rule.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Khojeste. Malcolm, I think I'd quite like to move on here because we've got a few more questions. I'm going to move to the last question, actually, Khojeste, because I think you have a wealth of information to answer. It's something about, if you could talk to us about the Zoroastrian community in modern day Iran.
The concept of talking about Iran, modern day Iran, let me say that I have been visiting Iran since my student days, and it is a land steeped in Zoroastrian history, culture, and where the living faith has been practiced, certainly over a period of recorded history, going back 2,500 years for sure, since the days of Cyrus the Great and the other great Zoroastrian kings. Iran has a living tradition of Zoroastrianism, very different, I think, to the Parsi one in India, where the community in India, with some minor hiccups, has never suffered religious persecution. The Iran story is different, that despite acute deprivation and hardship, the Iranian Zoroastrian community has survived with its religious beliefs and practices over the vicissitudes of time. The land of Iran, in my view, breeds Zoroastrian history, which is unique in the world. To think that in the province of Fars, great kings like Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Arsaces, Ardashir, Shapur, and a whole host of prelates and priests walked in this region as powerful Zoroastrians, for me is a very, very important personal experience. Clearly, present-day Zoroastrian rituals have changed and are very different to what existed in a bygone era. But nevertheless, there is a continuity of the traditions with the past, which I believe is relevant to the Zoroastrian psyche of modern-day Iran. Zoroastrian Iran has some of the oldest perpetually burning fires in the world. So, for example, the oldest perpetually burning fire in Sharifabad goes back 1,500 years. That's older than the Iran Shah fire that we have in India. Zoroastrian Iran also has a number of holy shrines, has a number of divinities of Zoroastrian pantheons like Mer, Bahram, Ashtar, Tishtria, all linked to a historical past. The shrines of Banu Pars, Pir Savs that you see on your screen just now, Pir Hirish, Pir Noraki, and Setepir are all linked to the family members of the great Zoroastrian king Yazdegerd Shahryar, whose family and daughters in particular fled from the invading Arabs to seek sanctuary in the remote locations in the mountains surrounding the city of Yazd. Zoroastrians with great fervor and merriment go on an annual pilgrimage to these remote mountain shrines for 5 days, seeking the blessings of the wife and daughters of the last Sassanian king. These pilgrimages also fulfill a very important social coming together of families from all over Iran and now also from Zoroastrian Iranians living abroad. In recent years, a number of Parsis, as Sarah mentioned earlier, have visited Iran from India because of modern travel, and they have been exposed, if you like, to the beautiful history and religiosity of Zoroastrian Iran. At Koh-e-Damavan, which is the tallest peak, not only in Iran, but in Central Asia, Zoroastrians perform Jashan ceremonies there, and that again, I think, is very important and relevant. It is believed that it is from Koh-e-Damavan that the last Messiah, Shah Behram Varzavan, will actually emerge. The Zoroastrian community is dwindling in Iran, with a number of our young wishing to settle abroad for a better economic future. Many years ago, I was given of 30,000 card-holding Zoroastrians, though I've now been told that the population has dwindled to no more than about 18,000 Zoroastrians living in Iran. The small towns and villages where Zoroastrians used to live are now deserted because of a lack of a better future. The literacy rate in Iran, thank God, amongst the Iranian Zoroastrians is very high, but the opportunities to become professionals is very limited and restricted even today. Despite various setbacks, Zoroastrian festivals like Mergan, Tirgan, Jashan-e-Sadeh, the seasonal festivals, Gambars, the Festival of All Souls, and the most important, Nowruz, is celebrated not just by the Zoroastrians, but the whole of Iran and millions of others living in Central Asia. To conclude then on this particular question, we've had 4 wonderful academics who have worked extensively and written in English on the social-religious fabric of the Zoroastrian community in Iran. A.B.W. Jackson from Columbia in the late 19th century. My own professor, the late Mary Boyce, in the mid-60s, who spent many months living in Sharifabad and who wrote extensively on Zoroastrian beliefs and practices. Mike Fisher, who did work on the Iranian Zoroastrians in the early 70s. And of course, you have another great person sitting in front of you, Dr. Sarah Stewart, who has produced 2 volumes recently reporting on the oral testimonies showing how the Zoroastrians have preserved their religious practices and their way of life in and around Yazd and Kerman. So I think this is what I would like to say to you all, to share with you my great affinity and great love that I have for Zoroastrian Iran and the people who continue to practice Zoroastrianism, albeit in a somewhat different way.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer, Khojeste, and overview insight into the community in Iran. It answered my question, actually, I think, which is how would you explain the tenacity with which this tiny community holds on to its religion in Iran, despite all the difficulties. Malcolm, perhaps you'd like to comment or question, add a question to that.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Just basically, we find, and I've had the privilege to accompany Khojeste on 2 occasions to Iran, and it was always, was an eye-opener, and it'll always remain in my memory, I think, till the day I die. But one of the sad things is, of course, in Iran, we have had, post the Arab invasions, our community has dwindled down the millennia. And the question I would like to ask Khojeste is this, that why do you think that India today happens to be an important center of Zoroastrianism?
Malcolm, India is an important center for Zoroastrianism for many, many reasons. To start with, for those of you who don't know, the Parsis arrived in India in the 10th century CE as religious refugees 300 years or so after the Arab conquest. The Hindu king Jadavrana gave sanctuary to the Parsis, the Parsi migrants, if you like. 5 conditions were sought from them. The first condition was explain your religion. The second condition was lay down your weapons. The third condition was that the Parsi women should wear the local sari. The fourth condition was that we should learn to speak the Gujarati language. And the fifth and the most unusual condition was that our wedding should take place after the sun sets. Why this condition was demanded, I have no idea. Nobody's been able to give me a rational reason for it, because as you know, Hindu weddings take place right through the day, depending upon an auspicious time. What was important is that when the Parsis arrived in India, they asked Jadavrana, the Hindu king who gave them sanctuary, that they wanted to build a fire of victory because they had landed safely along the western coast of India, some 170 kilometers north of Mumbai. Jadavrana, it seems, gave them land, and as a result, a fire temple was built. This is not the fire temple in Sanjan, but the holy fire that was built, consecrated 1,000 years ago, today burns in this fire temple in Udvada, some 20 kilometers north of Sanjan. The Parsis coming to India have, I believe, preserved their ritual traditions, etc., in a very, very interesting and important way. Fortunately, we've had links with Iran, and therefore manuscripts and Persian and so forth was something that many of the senior Parsi priests learned. Parsi priests were sent to Iran to bring back to India knowledge about the religion. This came to be known as the Persian Rivats, and so it is very, very interesting that Parsis from India continue to make contacts with Zoroastrian Iran. So the Parsis, in a sense, have faithfully preserved the tradition. Here you see a boy in the slide reading the Vandidad in the Avestan script. He's a boy from one of our local madrasas. It so happens that in India, and specifically in Mumbai, we have two madrasas that train priests to perform the highest of the high rituals. That is a very important thing, because it's high rituals today are only performed in India and nowhere else in the world. The community living here, first under Hindu rule, Muslim rule, and then under British India, obviously grew, developed, slowly became prosperous from being agriculturists, and eventually they availed themselves of Western education, specifically schools and colleges, which resulted in Parsis about 140 years ago becoming doctors, lawyers, accountants, businessmen, industrialists, literally every single profession that exists in India, I'm sure you will find a Parsi name. In my view, therefore, the religion has been institutionalized without any persecution whatsoever. Hindu India has been wonderfully tolerant to the Parsis living here, and as a result of which our religion we were able to practice it freely. And one of the important reasons for this is being a non-proselytizing faith. No other community living in India saw the Parsis as a threat. So the community, for example, at its height in the 1950s were 114,000 Parsis in the whole of India. Today has dwindled to 57,000 odd, according to the 2011 census figure. But many, many Parsis in the last 50 years have migrated either to Europe, to England, and of course, in large numbers to North America. I reckon that there must be at least about 20,000 plus Parsi Irani Zartushtis living in North America, where they are obviously trying to establish their own form, if you like, of Zoroastrianism. So in my view, the Parsi contribution is huge compared to our minuscule numbers living in India. The legacy, I believe, comes from the religion, which encourages one to live a happy, righteous, comfortable life through the seeking of knowledge, by working hard, and to make the world a happier and a better place to live in. We have 150 fire temples in India, of which 8 fire temples are cathedral fires, the fires of victory, which, according to me, would take about 14,000 hours of ritual consecration to establish such a fire. In the 150 fire temples in India, 50 fire temples are consecrated in Mumbai and its suburbs. So because of the institutionalization of the religion through our priestly schools, through the devotion of our priests, through the maintaining and tending of 150 fire temples in India, libraries that we have that show a large number of Zoroastrian manuscripts and books, etc., we've been able to, in some ways, preserve the Zoroastrian tradition that we brought from Iran to India in a much, much more cohesive way. Iran has the history. India practices, if you like, the rituals of the religion in a thorough way that is not done anywhere else in the world. So both communities, I think, complement each other and must therefore always live together.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Khojeste, and thank you, Malcolm, for asking that final question. I'm conscious now that we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I think I would like to start with them. I've been keeping an eye on them, and sort of they're mostly, I think, devoted to questions on the religion. There are a few other ones that I'd like to include as well. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to take everybody's questions, but you can always write in to Khojeste or to Malcolm or to me, and indeed there will be another opportunity, as Dr. Curtis mentioned, for discussion at an event at the end of the year, towards the end of the year. So questions. There are two that they're about the Fravohar. I'm not going to give the names of people because many are anonymous and some have only just given an initial. Somebody asks, can you talk about the Fravohar? Isn't it a Ahura Mazda depicted? Is it a Ahura Mazda or divinity? In the carvings found at Persepolis and elsewhere, do you think its meaning today is believed by modern Zoroastrians is correct? And then the other question is, can you say something about the role of fire and the Fravohar in Zoroastrianism?
Okay, the Fravohar is central to Zoroastrian iconography, and scholars have suggested that it is the representation of Ahura Mazda. It comes originally from Mesopotamian art in the 5th century BCE, and then became a very important symbol, a religious symbol in Achaemenian Iran. I see the Fravashi or the Fravohar as the essence of Ahura Mazda within one. And therefore, yes, the Fravashi does have, if you like, a strong connection with Ahura Mazda, but I see Ahura Mazda in terms of the Fravashi as the essence of Ahura Mazda and not per se an anthropomorphized version of Ahura Mazda himself. The Fravashi, of course, explains the attributes of the Fravashi, and it is said that every Zoroastrian has both a soul and a spirit, and the Fravashi upon death goes back into the spiritual world, which implies that it has to be the spirit of Ahura Mazda, who obviously cannot be judged because Ahura Mazda is totally good and perfect. So that is as far as Ahura Mazda, the Fravashi, is concerned. As far as fire is concerned, again, I'm on slightly tricky grounds. As far as I'm concerned, we have enough evidence to show that Zoroastrians are fire worshippers, because fire worship is the 7th creation of Ahura Mazda. We worship fire, and in the important Atash Nioyesh, which is the litany to fire, do we not say, Twa atrash putra aura masdao, O fire, son of our master? So fire, therefore, not only is the seventh creation of our master, but is seen as the son of our master. Fire is seen as the life-giving energy or force which permeated the other six creations and brought the other six creations alive, according to the Bundahishan, the book of creation. And so I don't see fire as a symbol. A symbol, in a sense, is animate and dead, is inanimate. Whereas the fire has to be tended, has to be cared for, and in none other than the Atashnoish prayer, the fire actually asks the worshipper, what has the standing friend brought to the sitting friend? In other words, the offering of sandalwood, which we take to a fire temple, or sweet-scented wood, once again reflects the strong belief of fire worship and not just fire to be seen as a symbol.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take another question, which is in the Fravarani, which I should say is a prayer, is thought of as a kind of creedal prayer. The name of the religion is expressed as the Ahuric religion. So which name is correct, Ahuric or Zoroastrian?
What it says in the Fravarani is Mas Diesno Zartushtrish. That is the worship of Master through Zarathustra. And towards the end we say, Yahenti namcha, Bushyenti namcha, Masishtacha, Vahishtacha, Sreshtacha, Ya Ahurish, Zartushtrish. In other words, the religion given by Ahura Mazda to Zarathustra is the best, the mightiest, and the purest. So in the declaration of faith, we are in an extremely clear way declaring our allegiance to the worship of Master, and the worship of Master through, in that sense, the teachings of Zarathustra.
Good, thank you. So moving on, this is a question about in India, they use the term sky burials at the Tower of Silence. And in cities like Bombay, it's been in crisis due to the reduced vulture population. I know you're an expert on this. Would you be able to expand how the burial practices of Zoroastrian Parsis in India have adjusted to these ecological changes? Has the inability to deal with the dead in an appropriate way created a moral, cultural, or ethical crisis in Indian Parsi communities?
Well, the Tower of Silence mode of disposal is used because one has to understand that death is the temporary triumph of evil and not the work of God. That's the first point that one needs to understand, unlike the other religions where life and death come from the same creator. If you understand this theological position that once a Zoroastrian dies, what is known as Nasa. Nasa is the demoness of putrefaction, which begins to increase as time goes on after death. We cannot bury our dead because that's polluting the earth. We cannot burn our dead because that's desecrating fire. So the only available mode of disposal that none other than Herodotus talks of is exposing the dead on mountaintops with regard to the ray of the sun. Now, yes, in Mumbai, the vultures have disappeared, but the sun continues to be a very effective agent of dehydration. So even in the monsoon months, believe it or not, the body decomposes faster than when it's non-monsoon times. So the process of decomposition in Zoroastrianism does take place even when the vultures were there. There is no evidence to suggest that the vultures would consume every single part of the body. We have evidence to show that if the vultures were full, because they only have an appetite of 300 grams per adult bird, there was no way with 3 bodies of going in every day into the Tower of Silence that the vultures would have been able to, in a sense, completely devour all the Zoroastrians consigned to the tower. I would say to you, the Tower fulfills an important ecological role. It's egalitarian, whether you're the richest person or the poorest person, the mode of disposal is exactly the same. That is very important. It is eco-friendly. So, for example, in Mumbai, the Tower of Silence is surrounded by 55 acres of forest land. Which city in the world does have a forest as large as what we do out here? So, in a sense, the Tower of Silence mode is working well, providing the Towers of Silence are kept clean and proper, which is what's happening in Mumbai. Mumbai has the largest death ratio in the world, with 2 bodies going into the Tower of Silence every day. We have no issues of pollution, no issues of disease, nothing whatsoever. So I would say to you that this traditional mode of disposal of the dead is very, very important. And furthermore, where in Iran, in the midst of the desert, would you have flocks of vultures coming to devour dead bodies? Obviously, even in Iran, it's the sun that did the trick, as it were, of decomposing the body for the bones to remain, and the bones remain. Eventually, they turn into powder or dust. But at the point of resurrection, it is said that our Master will once again remake the body with the same bones for the resurrection and the last judgment to take place. And this is why through history we've had ossuaries where the bones of the Zoroastrian dead were preserved. This is why I think the hypogeums in Iran, the sarcophagus of Cyrus, all fulfill a very, very important Zoroastrian religious position.
Well, that's, I'm sure our listeners will find that a fascinating response for those who know nothing about it. I'm switching to something rather different now. It's an interesting question. Could you discuss the ways in which you think Zoroastrian theology has significantly impacted the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam?
Well, certainly we know now historically and from the world of scholarship that because Cyrus liberated the Jews and allowed them to go back to Palestine to rebuild the Second Temple in the 5th century BCE, the Jews were very, very beholden to Cyrus and the subsequent Zoroastrian kings, Darius, Xerxes, and so forth. We also know that a lot of the eschatological concepts that are enshrined in Zoroastrianism, the concept of heaven and hell, the concept of individual judgment, the concept of resurrection, the concept of the coming of the Messiah, the concept of the last judgment. These are mainstream Zoroastrian theological ideas which entered post-exilic Judaism during the exilic period for the Jews, and that then became central to Jewish belief. I would say to you, the concept of resurrection, again, is central to Christianity. Jesus rose from the dead on the 4th morning, 3rd morning after death. In Zoroastrianism, that happens at the end of time. As far as Islam is concerned, one of the practices which seems to have a strong Zoroastrian connection is praying 5 times a day that the Muslims do. This is something the Zoroastrians have followed. It would seem soon after the time of Zarathustra himself. It was Mary Boyce who suggested that the 2nd and the 5th watches of the day were introduced by Prophet Zarathustra, and before that, the ancient Iranians had 3 watches of the day. So this business of praying 5 times a day, washing oneself before prayer, etc., to me seem to be mainstream Zoroastrian concepts that entered mainly Judaism, and then I think trickled into Christianity, and probably to a lesser degree into Islam.
Good, well, thank you. Another question, I'm now switching to perhaps not so much on the religion, but perhaps things that would be of interest to our listeners. So so somebody thanks, I should say that many people are thanking you for a wonderful presentation. And some of the questions are very, very long, so I'm actually not able to take those. But somebody says, what was and are the rights of women, and do women hold religious leadership roles? And thanking you for this interesting session.
One has to look at Zoroastrianism from a historical perspective. Because it's so ancient, obviously Iranian society was structured, and the original texts, etc., when they were compiled and eventually written down, do indicate a very strong patrilineal position. Just as, for example, the Jews, from a religious point of view, show a matrilineal position. So early religions, in my view, particularly those religions which do not convert, which are non-proselytizing, either take the patrilineal route or the matrilineal route. In other words, the line goes through the male or through the female. At an ethical level, there is equality between Zoroastrian men and women. There's no doubt about it. But at a social level, there have been differences. The men have certain duties to perform, the women have certain duties to perform. And I think the Zoroastrian answer would be that men and women have to complement each other in all that they do for one to lead a successful life.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Khojeste. I think I'm going to have to take the last question now, which is sad because we've got an awful lot of questions, but we have to bring this session to an end. I'm going to end on a slightly whimsical one. I think it must come from a Parsi. Would it be possible to teach our new priests to recite our lovely prayers in a more harmonious way, rather than just reciting the text without a gentleness that is conveyed in the meaning of the prayers? You might be the right person to look into this.
Well, I can certainly try. The priests have a very arduous and difficult task. Remember that not only do they have to undertake all their priestly training and studies, but they also have to go to secular schools. So the workload on a young boy is incredibly heavy. And this is something that not many members of the laity understand. Obviously, the prayers have to be taught by rote, but yes, there is a better way of saying it. The pronunciations, of course, can improve because the pronunciations changes the grammatical structure of the sentence and so forth, whether it be in Avestan or Pahlavi. So I would say to you that yes, the right intonation is very important, and they're taught chanting the prayers, but they're taught chanting the prayers in order to perform the rituals effectively. And this is why perhaps they're not chanted as harmoniously as one would like them to be chanted. If they chanted the prayers harmoniously for a ritual, instead of a ritual, say, taking 1 hour, it would take 6 hours. And that, in this modern day and age, doesn't make practical sense. But I take your point. I have interacted with the priests. I have taught priests who have ended up being what are called Yazdatraga priests, priests who perform the highest of the high rituals. And I assure you, when they do the Jashan Thanksgiving ceremony, the way they say their prayers with their ritual gestures, etc., actually does something to one spiritually. It's very, very, very beautiful.
Well, thank you again, Khojeste. So it remains now for me to thank you, of course, for a wonderful, wonderful session, to Malcolm for your contribution, and to all of you for listening, but particularly to Dr. John Curtis and to Astrid Johansson at the Iran Heritage Foundation for putting together the series and thinking of this in particular to highlight the Zoroastrian exhibits in the wonderful Epic of Iran exhibition. So for anyone who is in a position to be able to go, I do urge you to get your tickets and to visit. So with that, I'm going to say thank you again and goodbye from me.
I'd like to say a very big thank you to John Curtis, to Astrid, and to the Iran Foundation for having given me this wonderful opportunity to interact with participants probably from all over the world. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Malcolm, as well, for being such good people, friends, as well as people who have asked the questions. And I hope overall people are satisfied with what they've heard. So a big, big thank you. And in Western, I'd like to say, Ata Jamiat Yata Afrinami. May it be so as I wish. Ushtate, happiness to you.
Thank you. Thank you again. And for anyone who's disappointed at not having questions answered, please address them to Khojeste, to Malcolm, to me, as you wish. So goodbye for now.